Hello and welcome to another great week of project management talk with Andy Molnar. So this week we're discussing monitoring and information systems. But to be honest, I have a hard time differentiating monitoring from controlling. Controlling is the bulk of next week. And frankly, we've been discussing monitoring and controlling the entire process. Now, monitoring and controlling, as I like to say, is project work which involves tracking the actual project performance with the planned project management activity. So it can mainly be looked at as a control function that takes place at all stages of the project, from the very beginning at initiating through the very end at closing. Now, the projects are not operations, but they have things in common with operations, one of which is control. Operations focuses on ongoing production and is outside the scope of project management, right? Operations management is responsible for overseeing, directing, and controlling business operations. And they both have control in common. And if you recall from one of the earlier weeks, they both fall under the PMO, the Project Management Office, but they are different. Now, this was the slide out of the book. I'm not a big fan of this approach. Instead, I prefer my own, which is right here. So basically, we build the plan and with the budget as part of that plan, right? We've integrated all the pieces. Then I would use this chart to work your actual monitoring and controlling processes. We'll have the work performance data coming in from the execution part when we're building the deliverable. And that's tied, building the deliverable, to that direct and manage project work. That's what that's doing. And we're going to analyze the data to compare the plan versus actual, and that analysis is going to give us work performance information. With this, I can then assess variances and gaps in yellow on all of those control type processes. Once I've assessed those gaps, now I'm able to go down in red at the bottom and perform integrated change control, where I'm going to gather documents, assess authorizations and future expenditures for change using this process below, which you can study at your leisure. I also like to mention in monitoring that we want to be careful about the integration of configuration and change, right? So on the left, we want to maintain configuration control, the processes that we've built, the deliverables we're working on, and there are ways we can do that. We can do it through configuration identification at first, then configuration audits, sticking with the management plan of configuration, etc. On the right-hand side, we can operate change control if we have to. So because the whole time we're trying to integrate in the middle in red the project plan, the scope statement, the baselines, and all these other deliverables that we've been talking about, including the sub-deliverables down below: scope, schedule, cost. I have scope twice: quality, comm, risk, procurement, and stakeholders, right? And so you can use the integrated change control process to even manage the configuration that you've established for your project. Now, we are designing then a monitoring system through these various steps that I've just outlined. We want to collect the necessary data, as I mentioned, but do you want to collect too much? You know, it doesn't really matter to me as long as you have the right size team to analyze it. I'm good to go. There are 5 telltale signs, though, that your project is in trouble, right? And they're listed here, right? If you didn't plan in detail, expect muddied waters. Winston Churchill once said, "However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. For those results, whether good or bad, will tell you how you handled the details." Now, without the accent of someone from the British Isles, that is a great quote, though, otherwise. And that assesses eliminating the muddy waters. Probably more detail. The second one, mysterious stakeholders. That comes from stakeholder identification process, and we want to be careful to do that thoroughly. The stakeholders are going to provide us the requirements, and a missed stakeholder means a missed requirement, which will be costly and painful later. Okay, for the third one, we want to beware of unconstrained constraints, right? Remember, constraints are factors that limit the team options, so you'll want to be aware of them, and you capture them, constraints and assumptions, in the assumptions log. As you recall, assumptions are things that are assumed true without proof, right, which makes them a risk. So frankly, risks, assumptions, and constraints can all cause project problems along the way, right? And just note to yourself, any of the management plans can become constraints in your project, but the 6 key constraints in my mind are cost, risk, resources, quality, scope, and schedule. PMI ethics would be clear about the fourth one. Be honest, face issues head on, address them. And then, of course, team troubles, right? Refer to Tuckman's stages of team development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, for more guidance in there. In fact, I included that slide here. It's really shown 2 different ways. One in bullets, right? This is about building trust and cohesiveness, building productivity within your project, using Tuckman's stages of team development. I list them in bullets in the middle, but then below I repeat the same thing in kind of a stair-step thing. It's just really a duplication. But what I've added is what the PM is doing in each process. So in forming, you're telling your team what to do. Developing trust. In storming, you're guiding and coaching. In norming, you give them some autonomy, but you'll participate a little bit. When the team gets to high performing, you just delegate, give them the space to work, and then you help them with their next assignment. Now, everyone concerned with the project should be appropriately tied into the project reporting system. So this monitoring system ought to be constructed so that it addresses every level of management, but reports need to be of the same depth and they're the same frequency for each level, right? So lower level people have a need for detailed information about individual tasks and factors affecting those tasks. Where higher level, you might just report a milestone chart, right, and address them and answer their higher level questions, right? That would be for senior managers. So they might get an overview report, which describes the project in a more aggregated form going up the chain. So the reporting process has a relationship, and the relationship of project reports to the project action plan or the work breakdown structure is key to the determination of both the report content and the frequency, which often come up. So reports must contain data that's applicable to the control of the specific task. See how through this whole conversation, I'm not really able to differentiate or segregate monitoring from controlling. I really think they both belong together. So this chapter this week and next week, consider them in context, in unity, not as separate weeks really. So the frequency of reporting should be great enough to allow control to be exerted during or before the period in which the task is scheduled. You really don't want to fall behind. You don't want to make changes after the fact if you can help it. And so this distribution of the project reports, that will depend on who's interested, right? And back when we talked about stakeholder analysis, that was part of the analysis. You collected their needs, their interests, their expectations for your project, and now you've built a communications plan that will distribute these reports based on their interest, right, to satisfy them or to solicit the right input. Remember, when we're monitoring communications, that's actually the process. It's not about a cell phone number or an email list. It's really about collecting data, storing it, retrieving it, formatting it, distributing it, and eventually disposing of the data along the way. That's really what that is about in a process report. There are many benefits to detailed and timely process reports listed here, and amply discussed in the curriculum in the book this week. So report types are routine, exception, and special analysis reports. I've included this summary slide, which you won't find in the book, but it's a sample of what I mean by what the reports you will communicate, right? And it's about communicating. This is what your leadership wants, a status report on where the project is now versus the plan, the project plan. The progress report, what's been accomplished. A trend report, right? What are these results over time? Are we improving or deteriorating? Essential in risk management to highlight triggers. Forecast reports, which is going to predict the future status. We talked about that in cost management a little bit when we talked estimate to completion or estimate at completion. Those are forecasts. A variance report compares the actual results, the actual data versus what you planned. The baselines are a good example of that. You'd produce variance reports. Earned value report is addressed in the literature quite well, but it integrates scope, cost, and schedule. We know them mathematically as PV, EV, and AC. Of course, then you could also do a lessons learned report. Those are just some good samples of the type of reports that you will use to communicate to your stakeholders. And of course, you can't have a project without meetings. Anyhow, so they are essential, actually, and it's important to document them. Honestly, a great meeting should have an agenda set out in advance. You only invite the people that need to be there. You know, these meetings where we invite the same people over and over and over and over without consideration. Have an agenda, invite the right people. Have a timed agenda. Have a separate person who's a facilitator that monitors the time. When you go around the room at the end, don't let people talk on and on. Give them a 5-minute time limit or less. If there are new issues brought to the table that are outside the agenda, I would ask them to put it in an email afterwards, unless it's critical, unless it's urgent, right now, crisis and chaos devolving the project. I would say now is not the time. We'll consider that at the next meeting. Then after the meeting, make sure that you put out the results, including taskers and who's responsible. And frankly, that's what I would start the next meeting with, essential. Okay, here are some other meeting rules that you can consider. Most of them kind of a summary of what I just mentioned. And then there are common reporting problems, right? The book says too much detail. I've never been a victim of that. I want more detail so I can ask the great questions, right? But what I do find are true are the poor interface and poor correspondence. It's all about communicating, right? Those are really the most common reporting issues. Earned value analysis, that was one of the types of format reports that I mentioned just a few minutes ago that a lot of stakeholders like to get. And that goes back to cost management. To see earned value in action, right, you can see it best in a picture. And here's a picture which we talked about in stakeholder management. Now, the book says that the measures here are just in terms of dollars, for example, right? It doesn't matter what the measure is as long as they're all common mathematically, whether they're one's in dollars, they're all in dollars. If one's in hours, the rest are in hours. If one's in minutes, the rest are in minutes. They could be in man hours or man days, right? Sometimes a common term in human resources. And so don't forget then you're comparing your actual cost in blue to the earned value or the work that's been accomplished in your project. And you're trying to stay on that white line, which is your budget, your planned budget at completion. If you go over or under, you'll end up at EAC. EAC is one of those forecasted status reports that I mentioned. That's estimate at completion. You see where it's a little higher than the budget at completion. So there's a problem there that you'll want to address and stakeholders will want to know about. And the pink lines really just show that the project has slipped, and those are things to correct. They call it slippage formally. This was a similar chart, the S-curve that the book referenced. I like mine better. How about that? Okay, I'm going to take a break here. We're going to come back to the final couple of slides for this week.